Okay, let me start the introduction again. Today we have Florian from the University of Michigan School of Information. He's the assistant professor there. His research is really interdisciplinary, combining privacy, human factor, emerging technologies, and public policy. He studies people's privacy decision-making and behavior, investigates technology-related privacy implications, and develops human-centric privacy solutions that help people better manage their privacy in technology context. Florian holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Ulm and was a postdoc fellow in Carnegie Mellon University's School of Computer Science. His research has been honored with the 2019 Caspar Boden Awards for Outstanding Research in Privacy-Enhancing Technologies and with Best Paper Awards at ACM Chi, Usenix Security, and SOAPS. Florian is a DARPA Young Faculty Award recipient. His research has directly impacted industry practice and public policy, including the rulemaking process for the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act. Today, he will talk about human-centric privacy design and engineering. And I guess this would be a very interesting talk. Now I pass the stage to Florian.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be here. I wish I could be with all of you in person, but you know, this works too. And thank you for the invitation. Yeah, and I want to talk today a little bit about human-centric privacy design and engineering. And I'm going to give an overview of our research in this area. And I'm happy to take questions during the talk or after, whatever works best for people. So there are lots of reasons why we might want to build privacy into systems, right? There are legal requirements that make that necessary. Maybe we want to create more user trust in the systems we build, but maybe it's also just the right thing to do it. And over the last couple of years, maybe the last decade, we've seen a lot of kind of interest in maturity first in privacy compliance. How do you comply with laws like the GDPR? What does it mean to actually manage privacy in organizations, and ultimately privacy engineering, right? Like how can we build privacy directly into our technologies? One problem with this is that it's often a very expert-centered perspective, right? Like people are very good at the technical aspects of privacy, but the user perspective can sometimes look quite different. So for example, here's a Pew Research Center survey from 2019. And what they found is that many people are concerned, this is with US adults, what they found is that many people are concerned over data use, both by companies and the government. But despite that, that doesn't necessarily translate into action. And in the academic literature, this is sometimes called the privacy paradox, right? People say they care about privacy, but then you look at what they actually do, and they post frequently on social media, they do all kinds of things that run apparently counter to their stated preferences. Rather than calling this a paradox, I like to think of this more as the fallacy of revealed preferences, right? So just because someone engages in a behavior that maybe undermines their privacy doesn't mean they care any less about their privacy, or that they're necessarily happy with having to give up that privacy. There's a great paper from last year by Alessandro Acquisti, Laura Prandimater, and George Dilbenstein that looks exactly at this, right? Like what are what's the drive for privacy and the difficulty for people in actually achieving privacy? And I'm just going to give you like a small peek into this. In our own work, we've looked particularly at exposure sensitive populations. What I mean by this is populations, communities, groups that have a heightened interest in protecting their privacy because of potentially severe consequences of one type or another. And what we find is that even these populations, despite their heightened interest in privacy, often struggle with managing privacy effectively in their interactions with technology. For instance, a couple of years ago, we did research with undocumented immigrants in the United States. And what we found is that many of the people we talked to in these interviews had actually a pretty good understanding of risk in their daily lives. They were very careful. They had very sophisticated risk avoidance strategies that ranged from making sure they would never leave their children home alone because they're worried of immigration rates, or they would not drive a car because in the state where we did these interviews, they couldn't obtain a driver's license, a legal driver's license. But when we looked at how they interacted with technology, they had the same struggles as everyone else in terms of how do you actually regulate what's seen by whom, what information do you share and don't share. And one of the things that we found particularly concerning is that there was often an unawareness that the platforms, the tools, the apps they're using are also party to their communications and may have to cooperate with law enforcement and actually hand over data. In a different context, we saw similar problems emerge with sex workers, right? And sex workers use technology a lot, both for work, for their main business, but also for safety reasons, to inform each other about potentially dangerous clients and things like that. But what we found is that often the platforms they use make it also really difficult for them to maintain their privacy. So we had people who used Facebook both for work as well as personally, and then found that the Facebook people you may know algorithm would actually suggest clients to them as friends and the other way around, and that way would potentially out their professional identity to their personal network. And so just because you want privacy doesn't mean you can easily get it with the current systems we have. And we're currently working with funding from DARPA to better understand what are actually these privacy needs for different populations, and what are maybe universal privacy needs, and what are more community-specific privacy needs, and what are actually the areas where individual preferences really matter. So this is ongoing work. Yeah. But let me give you an overview of what we know so far of why people struggle to protect their privacy. Again, great paper by Alessandro Acquisti, Laura Franny-Martin, and George Lowenstein from 2015 boils it down to three aspects. There's a lot of uncertainty about privacy risks, and people often don't have enough information to make really informed decisions. But people are also not very good at making consistent decisions when it comes to privacy. And one of the reasons for that is that privacy is very contextual, right? Like small changes to who actually gets the data, who's collecting data, can have a large impact on your exposure. But then there's also, people are also susceptible to dark patterns and other tricks to get them to reveal more information than they might be comfortable with. And all of these things in combination can make it really difficult for people to maintain the level of privacy or achieve the level of privacy they're aiming for. Very simple example of this is privacy policies, right? Like no one reads privacy policies, yet they're kind of touted as these tools of informing consumers and creating transparency from consumers. But it's not that people don't read it, it's also people probably shouldn't read them. There's work by Alicia McDonald and Laurie Craner from 2008, where they estimated that if people would read the privacy policies of all the websites they visit, they would have to spend 244 hours doing that per year, right? And that's from 2008. That's before we had the iPhone, before we had smartphones, before we had mobile apps, before we had smart home devices, before our cars were connected, right? Like the time is probably much, much higher these days. But even we were interested, well, what do privacy policies actually tell us? So together with colleagues at Ruhr University Bochum, we did a study in which we monitored the top 500 websites in each EU member state before the GDPR went into effect in May 2018. And we did kind of monthly crawls, and then also in May 2018, we did this more frequently. And we analyzed all kinds of different things. But one of the findings I want to talk about today is that what we found is that the average privacy policy after the GDPR went into effect was over 3,000 words long. That's a lot of text. And it's that's even more concerning if you compare this to 2016, before the GDPR was ratified, where we saw that the policies had gotten 42% longer. Now, that's actually maybe not a bad thing, right? Like we probably want companies to be more detailed in what they're doing with data and what their data practices are. But we should be honest about the fact that consumers are probably not reading this, and company lawyers are not writing this information for consumers. They're really writing it for regulators to demonstrate legal compliance, right? So privacy policies may be a good start, but maybe not the best tool for informing consumers. And even if people try to read and understand privacy policies, they often don't get very far. You might remember in 2019, it came out that first Amazon, but then the same was shown for Google and Apple and all the other smart assistant makers, that they had employees listen to and annotate some of these voice commands. Now, from a technical perspective, that totally makes sense, right? Like if you want to improve your speech recognition systems, you need to disambiguate kind of faulty recognition, and humans are pretty good at doing this. So of course you would have some humans annotate this data. But the problem is, if you look at and this is a snapshot from the Alexa FAQs at that time, right? If you look at what was actually explained about this, it just says, we use your requests to train our speech recognition and natural language understanding systems. Now, from this statement to understanding that that means someone might listen to what you're telling your smart speaker at 2 a.m. in the morning in the privacy of your home is quite a stretch, right? Like, I would say even for someone who has technical training, who's well versed in machine learning, natural language processing, it takes a moment to make that connection. Like, oh yeah, okay, they probably have people annotating this. For someone who doesn't have a background in computer science or training in machine learning, that leap is almost impossible to make without additional knowledge. And all of these aspects that people just really struggle to understand what privacy risks are, and this companies and organizations make it hard for them to do that, leads to something that Nora Draper and Joe Turow call digital resignation. Right? People care about their privacy, but they also care about the convenience that comes with technology. So they accept potential incursions into their privacy. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily happy about that. They're just resigned that that's what they have to give up if they want to use the technology. And then to make things worse, right? Companies and organizations have become really adept at using dark patterns to trick people into revealing more information than they might want to. And it's a great report by the Norwegian Consumer Protection Bureau from 2018. And since then, we've seen like an influx of work, both in the HCI community and the security community, looking at dark patterns and the proliferation of dark patterns across websites and mobile apps and other spaces. We did an experiment again together with collaborators at Ruhr University Bochum, where we looked at cookie notices, and we worked with a German online retailer website, and they were gracious enough to let us experiment with the design of the cookie notice. And what we were interested in is, you know, so we did this study where we analyzed websites before and after the GDPR, and we also looked at the cookie consent notices, and we found that there was quite a variance in what types of cookie notices were presented. So we wanted to see, does it actually, what notice you show, what design you choose, does it actually affect whether people give consent to cookies? And what we found is that simple things like just where do you show this notice on the screen has a significant impact on whether people interact with the notice, but not just interact with the notice, also whether they accept, right? So if you show the notice in the bottom left corner or in the bottom of the screen, people are much more likely to click the accept button, not because all of a sudden they care more about what this notice says, but mostly because it blocks content and they want to get to that underlying content, right? So it's very easy to engineer higher consent rates just by where you place your cookie notice. And you can tweak this even further, right? So if you employ what's called enhanced choice, you highlight what you want people to click, that significantly increases consent rates further, right? So just highlighting the accept button gets people to makes it more likely that people also click the accept button, but also interact with this notice in the first place. Attention is just drawn to this highlighted choice. And that even works if there's no choice, right? If it's just a consent dialog that only has an accept button, you can't even say decline. People are still more likely to click that accept button when you highlight it. So to us, that really draws into question this notion of informed consent and freely given consent, right? Like if it's so easy to trick people into giving their consent, what is really this expression of consent you're getting here? Is it actual consent? Someone understands what they're consenting to, or you're just getting a click on an interface element and you choose to interpret it as consent to data practices? In other areas, looking at smart speakers, we found that privacy controls often do not meet users' needs. We did this study where we talked to people who hadn't used smart speakers, but we also talked to people who were already smart speaker users. At that time, Amazon Alexa, Amazon Echo was really like the only speaker on the market, or the one with the highest market share. So most people had Echo devices, and we were really interested, like, oh, how do they protect their privacy around this smart speaker? How do they think about this? One of the things we found is that even though there were lots of privacy controls engineered into these systems, right? Like from, you need an activation keyword before the commands are sent to the server, there's a mute button on the device, all these things. We found people didn't actually use any of those controls for multiple reasons. One was that the mute button on top, right, which mutes the microphone, people thought it would mute the speaker rather than the microphone. So they didn't even think about doing it. But even if you click the button to mute the speaker, it means next time you want to say something, you have to go back to the speaker, you press the button. Right? And that's a modality shift in how you interact with a device. Usually you go and just talk to your smart speaker. You say, hey, Alexa, do this and that. Sorry if I just activated your smart speaker. If you make people go to the device, press a physical button, or you have them do something in the app to control their privacy, that creates an additional barrier compared to having voice commands for that. We also found that some people actually use some of these privacy controls to spy on other people. So if you're a smart speaker user, you're familiar with this. You can actually see prior commands in the mobile app or on the website that have been given to have been set to the smart speaker. And what we found is that some people use this to see what their babysitters or their house sitters were up to while they were gone. And or we talked to one parent who said, like, oh yeah, I store these recordings of my kids talking to the speaker because it's so cute. Other research by researchers at the University of Washington has shown that kids are really creeped out when they learn they're being recorded in ways they didn't expect. Right. So lots of issues with how these controls are being implemented right now. Privacy controls are also hard to find. In this study with collaborators at Carnegie Mellon, we looked at how easy or hard is it for people to do a simple setting, find privacy settings, right? And you can kind of see in gray the ideal path to get to a control. So how many user actions does it take to get there? And then in blue, that's kind of like the average participant average. How many actions and clicks did it take them to find the setting we wanted them to use? And you can see that just finding the account settings takes them 26 steps, right? Finding an opt-out that's just described somewhere in the privacy policy. People are clicking around 57, make 57 actions on a website before they actually find a specific opt-out. That's probably too hard, right? Like it's a lot of investment that people probably don't have in their daily lives compared to a user study. So this all is pretty bleak, right? And the question is, maybe, is technology just killing privacy? Should we stop worrying about it? I hope with this audience here, most of you agree that we should still keep worrying about privacy and protecting it. And I think one of the things that gives me hope and that has been good to see is that over the last decade, privacy issues have really come into the spotlight. We see increased privacy regulation, right? Like I'm sure all of you are familiar with the GDPR. And then, but even in the US with the California Consumer Privacy Act and the California Privacy Rights Act, it's the first comprehensive privacy law in the US, which is huge. And then other countries like Brazil, recently China, I think yesterday Rwanda adopted new privacy laws, right? So we increasingly see stricter and more comprehensive regulation when it comes to privacy and data protection. There's also more interest in oversight. For example, here it's a Facebook hearing in Congress from a couple of years ago. And I think we see the same in Europe with regulators and data protection authorities going after tech companies. And we see this in enforcement as well, right? Like in a couple of years ago, the FTC imposed a $5 billion penalty on Facebook because of their violations of a prior FTC decree that led to the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And this $5 billion fine is maybe a somewhat minor fine for Facebook, given their 55 billion annual revenue, right? But it's the highest fine that the US government has ever levied against a private company in the history of the United States. Right? So that tells you like privacy is really moving to the forefront of enforcement actions in meaningful ways. And I think in Europe, we've seen in the last couple of years, kind of like regulators and data protection authorities kind of inching up to higher and higher fines as well when it comes to GDPR violations. All right, so why should we design for privacy, right? Like there are these legal requirements and companies are interested in limiting liability, but I think there are also other aspects that matter, such as company reputation, user trust, and just respecting the users and the people who interact with your products. So, okay, so if that's the goal, if you actually want to design for privacy, how can we do this? Assuming you're not violating people's privacy on purpose anyway. One of the big problems is that privacy is often seen as a compliance issue, right? Like, okay, how do we comply with the requirements, the legal requirements, and that's important, right? But it's also, I would argue, we should really think about this more as a user experience and product design issue. Just slapping a privacy policy on somewhere or having a poorly designed cookie consent dialog is not actually going to get you to the point where people understand what you're doing with the data and help them make informed decisions. So we've been thinking about how can this be improved, and I think the first step is to start with what most companies are doing already, right? Like privacy impact assessments, practicing data minimization, practicing privacy by design, and then having public-facing privacy policies, also having internal data protection and privacy management processes. But that's really only the start if we want to make all of this useful and usable for people. What's really important is to understand people's mental models. What are their expectations? What do they think a technology actually does compared to, or what they think a technology does compared to what it actually does? And understanding people's privacy needs. What are their concerns and why they want to protect their privacy? And bringing those two pieces together requires privacy user experiences and user interfaces that should be usable, but also useful to people. And there are three key ingredients for getting there, in our opinion. One is information you provide to people needs to be relevant. And relevant can mean different things, right? In the first place, it should be relevant to the context of transaction a person is engaging in. So if you go today to a news website, if you look at the privacy policy, there are all kinds of things in that privacy policy, from what happens when you sign up for a subscription, when you get the print magazine, when you enter into a sweepstakes, all kinds of different things. Whereas if you're a first-time user of a website, what you probably most care about is, like, do you track what I read? Do you share this with advertisers? Is there anything else I should be knowing about what you're doing in this particular moment? Finding that information from the privacy policy is actually pretty hard. We did a study a couple of years ago where we looked at, well, how can we improve this, right? And what we asked people to, we showed them a fitness tracker, like a Fitbit watch at that point, and we asked them a bunch of steps about data practice. Hey, do you think this device is doing X? And what we found in this is that most people had a pretty good understanding of basic features of these devices, right? Like almost everyone expected that a fitness tracker would collect your steps because that's kind of what they're for. But then we also saw that some practices were really unexpected. So only 31% expected that location data would be collected, usually at this point through the mobile companion app on your smartphone, right? So now if you think about what is the relevant information to give to people, rather than telling them or putting front and center the collection of steps, it's probably much more important to highlight to people that location data is being collected, and potentially maybe that should be an opt-in practice rather than something that happens by default. But then it's also important to give information that really helps people understand the specific practice, right? I talked earlier about the smart speakers and training language models. You know, it might be good to say that this might involve people listening to your commands, because it helps people better understand what are the risks that come with that practice. But it also provides an opportunity to then talk about the protections that are put into place to make sure that information doesn't harm the individual's privacy. So right, like there's a lot of focus on kind of like explaining in generic terms as possible what a company is doing, whereas I think there's a lot of opportunity to be much more specific, and by doing that, helping people not just make more informed decisions, but also better convey, well, what are we doing on the back end actually to protect that data. The next thing is, if you present information to people, it needs to be understandable, it needs to make sense to them. And that's something as simple as reading level, right? Like there are all these studies that look at privacy policies, and they find like if you really want to understand a privacy policy, you need to have a college degree and college level reading skills in order to really understand what's going on in these privacy policies. Length is also an issue, right? Like many of these privacy policies are way too long. At the same time, this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. This is an example of a financial notice that financial institutions in the US are required to send out on an annual basis to their customers. And this is based on a template that was actually developed through user testing by a couple of federal agencies in the US. And while there still may be issues with this, right, it's a 2-page disclosure. It's not 3,000 words of text that you have to get through. And it presents information in a nice layout that is also amenable to machine analysis, right? Like you can actually apply NLP, you can extract information and allow for comparisons. And Laurie Craner's group at Carnegie Mellon has done some really interesting thing with these notices around bank privacy. And we see this in other places as well, right? Like Apple recently pushed out these privacy cards for mobile apps in their app store that really distill down this information to something much more meaningful and concise to people. And all these apps are still required to have a privacy policy, but the goal here is to layer on top of these privacy policies actual interfaces that might be useful for people who want to make decisions. When we talk about making this information understandable, I think we also need to think about the level of abstraction, right? And I think that's something that regulators and policymakers get wrong sometimes. So a really good example are cookie consent notices, right? Like I know these are even worse in Europe and the UK than they are in the US, but still, right? Like these are extremely annoying, and they're not particularly useful because people don't necessarily care about whether cookies are being placed on their computer or any other kind of tracking mechanism is used. What they care about is like, are you tracking me? And why are you tracking me? And how can I tell you not to track me? And those are the things we should be focusing on rather than on the specific technical implementation, which in this case happened to be a cookie, right? Also, like with the technical training, we know what a web cookie is, but most people think of cookies as like these nice, delicious snacks. And it takes a lot of like heavy lifting to explain to them what a cookie consent means in this context. So I think we really need to rethink our level of abstraction and what are the concepts we're actually asking for consent for. And then the final ingredient is for usable and useful privacy interfaces, it needs to be actionable. If you just give people information, a long privacy policy, but the only real option is to not use the service and do something else, it's useless. Why should anyone read this policy, right? Especially if somewhere in the policy, there's also a clause that says like, oh, we reserve the right to change our privacy policy anytime and will notify you on this page, right? So what does actionable mean? It means like providing information and then also linking specific actions to this, and also giving people real choices that make sense to them and allow them to assert their preferences in some kind of meaningful way. And I talked a lot about cookie notices, which I think is kind of like the failed example of doing that. But there's this other aspect here, like the mobile app permissions are pretty good choice interface, right? Like people can actually say, no, I don't want you to access my location, or I don't want you to read my SMS messages. And people do, right? People say no if they don't understand what what a request is for, they tend to say no usually. Except some of the counter aspect is that people are sometimes worried that if they say no, it might break something or the app might not work. But nevertheless, I think the interesting thing here is like these haven't really been thought of as consent interfaces, but they're serving that function and they're doing it relatively well. The other thing is that controls need to be usable, right? Like, and when we talk about integrating privacy into the user experience, one aspect here is to make sure you actually put them in the same kind of modality that people are interacting with. So when we talk about smart speakers, having voice commands to control privacy would be really useful. The participants in our study were looking for a guest mode, right? So that they could tell their smart speaker, hey, I'm having guests over tonight. Please switch to guest mode. And then, it would kind of lock down the functionalities and other things, whereas that's not really what you can do. And a couple of years ago, Amazon actually started introducing some voice commands for privacy, such as allowing you to say, Alexa, delete everything I said today, and then your prior voice commands are removed. So privacy user experiences should be relevant, understandable, and actionable. And the key is really to think about how can you integrate this into the user experience. And we thought a lot about this, and we kind of distilled it down to 4 dimensions when you think about like, well, what are the places, how can we actually convey privacy information or privacy interfaces? One is the timing. When do we actually show the notice? Does everything have to happen at setup when you're just like unboxing your device, right? And you're clicking through like a bunch of dialogues and everyone just says accept because they want to play with the new gadget? Or are there maybe better ways to present notices throughout use and for the first time a practice happens, so just in time, right? What's the appropriate channel for presenting privacy notices or controls? Is it the primary channel directly on this device in that context? Or is it maybe a mobile companion app or an out-of-band channel, such as an email or an SMS? Sometimes you need kind of public channels, right? So if you don't know who might be affected by this, examples of that could be autonomous vehicles that have like lots of cameras and might be filming people in their vicinity, right? Like how do you actually inform those people of the practices and give them control? The different modalities we can consider, rather than just making privacy notices textual, right? Like, can we have auditory notices? So things you can hear in the context of smart speakers that might be relevant, right? I think machine readable privacy notices and controls are also gaining traction again. I just showed the mobile permission dialogues, right? Like these are like declarative interfaces where a developer writes code and says like, writes down their permission requests and those get translated into actual dialogues. That's a machine readable privacy control. And then where do we actually integrate these controls? Do we do it in a way that kind of blocks interaction, or is it something that is available to people as they go through the user interactions, but doesn't block them from doing things? And the goal with this design space is really to help designers and engineers, but also lawyers kind of think about, well, where can we actually place our privacy interfaces, and what are our opportunities here? There's also a lot we can do to support people to reconsider their decisions and make informed decisions. So we did this work on privacy nudges a couple of years ago, where we would look at, well, what apps on the phone are accessing what resources, for example, location. And then we would show people these notices. Hey, did you know your location has been shared 5,398 times with the following apps, right? And these are real numbers at that point. And then we gave people the option to change their settings. And when you make people aware of what's going on their devices, which is otherwise invisible, right? Like they actually get curious and they make changes. And we can go further, right? Rather than just saying like, hey, your location has been accessed so many times, we can also use code analysis, right? Static dynamic code analysis to determine where are these calls coming from. Is it for core app functionality? Is it some kind of tracking library that's in that app that's trying to access the location data and give people much more fine-grained choices around that? Another work we looked at, how can we make privacy policies more useful and usable, and that resulted in the development of Pribot, a chatbot that basically allows you to ask free-form questions of any privacy policy, and then we can give you distilled answers or point you to the right places in the privacy policy to find more about this. And you can go to pribot.org and try that out if you want. In similar work, we developed a browser extension that extracts links from privacy policies, analyzes those links, and categorizes them in terms of whether they are opt-out links or not, and then presents all of this information in a concise browser extension where you can see like, oh, what are the choices you have on a given website, and you can also track whether you opted out or not, and that way get a sense of your exposure. And when we think about technology design, there are also like interesting opportunities in how we rethink what privacy actually means. So smart speakers work with a microphone that's always on, right? And even though there's this activation keyword, there's still the risks of faulty activations all the time. So we thought about, well, do we actually need to have this microphone on all the time, or can we look for social interaction cues to see when the device should be turned on? And we built prototypes that would only turn the microphone on if you looked at them, or if you spoke loudly enough to reach a certain volume threshold, and only then would the speech recognition kick on. And so they're interesting ways of kind of rethinking how we can actually build privacy into these systems. And then designing privacy into systems is great, but it also needs to be active by default. I mentioned these Alexa commands earlier for deleting voice commands. You actually have to go in the settings and activate those. They're not activated by default. And why? Right? Like, why is that a feature that is not on by default? So in general, I think privacy interfaces shouldn't be just compliance tools, but we should really think of them as opportunities to explain data practices and do that specifically, but also explain protections. And companies and organizations are investing so much money in being compliant with GDPR, and many companies retooled their internal data management processes over the last 5 years. Tell people what you do to protect your privacy. And by doing so, you might help build trust in these privacy protections, but you can also reduce the price, right? Like there are enough anecdotes of consumers in the media being outraged by things they find in privacy policies, or what is uncovered by researchers through deeper analysis of what devices are actually doing. Get in front of that and try to reduce that surprise. But then an important aspect I also want to note is it's important to test anything that's user-facing when it comes to privacy and security with actual people, right? As experts, we are pretty poor judges what works and doesn't work. And it's important to make sure we get data that tells us how effective is something. And I want to just talk about one specific anecdote here, which has to do with the California Consumer Privacy Act, and specifically with the do not sell my personal information opt-out that it requires. So for that opt-out, the original law foresaw an icon or a button that could kind of signify that opt-out, and the Office of the Attorney General for California, the OAG, they sent out, they put out a request for basically inputs in what this should look like. And together with colleagues at CMU and at Fordham University, we went through a pretty rigorous and multi-step process to design and test different icon variants, and also test different taglines. And we wrote up this report and sent it to the OAG. And what we found is that using our blue toggle icon with the tagline "Do not sell my personal information" actually leads to very few misconceptions, and people get a good sense of what to expect once they click that button. The OAG said thank you, and then shortly after they came out with draft regulations that included this red button down here. And it looks a little bit like our button, but you can also see that it's maybe not quite the same. And if you think about this a little more, you might realize this actually looks like a real button, right? It looks like you can directly make a choice here. So we saw this, and other people tweeted about this as well, and with a lot of concern, like, okay, will people think they're already opted out, even though they haven't interacted with this control yet? And so we ran another user study, and that's exactly what we found, right? If you compared the red icon with our blue one, and the design, not the color, we actually switched the colors to make sure that color doesn't have an effect here. what we found is that with this icon that was in the proposed regulations, people were much more likely to think they had already opted out, and they were worried if they would click it, they would opt back in to selling personal information, the sale of their personal information, which is exactly the opposite of what this icon is supposed to communicate, right? So these minor details can have a huge impact, and you only find this if you test with users. The reaction, so we did this additional study showing this. We sent in another report. The OAG said, thank you, came out with new draft regulations, and they just removed the icon. Well, okay, I guess that's a win. At least we don't have really confusing icon out in the wild. We then worked with them a bit more. We tested more icon ideas they had, and then finally in March 2021, they released the final CCPA regulations, and they included the icon we had designed and user tested as the official CCPA opt-out icon. And you can now go to the OAG's website and download it there, and I hope that companies will be using it. Our goal is actually that it shouldn't be just an icon for do not sell my personal information. We think it would be much more useful if it would be a privacy options icon, and companies can, or organizations can use it to signify, okay, go here to find your privacy options. All right, that takes me to the end of my talk. So I think the key takeaways is that privacy is about people, right? And that means when we want to really design useful and usable privacy solutions, we need to understand what are people's privacy needs. Anything that's user-facing needs to be really relevant to them. It needs to be understandable and actionable so that they can really express choices. And the way to do this is to integrate privacy into the user experience and think about this from the beginning rather than adding on privacy controls at the very end, or just tacking on a privacy policy. And with that, I want to close. If you want to learn more about the work, Laurie Craner and I authored a chapter on all of this called Usable and Useful Privacy Interfaces. It's in an IAPP book that came out last year. But this chapter happens to be also the sample chapter for the book. So you can Google for the title and you can find the sample chapter, which is our chapter, and you can read it for free. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Florian. Now we are waiting for questions. If you want to ask questions, you can ask directly or you can put in the chat. Right, I see someone raised the hand. Andrea, do you want to ask? Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Andrea Gadotti. I'm a researcher in the computational privacy group here at Imperial. And I'm also working with the European Data Protection Board on the guidelines on anonymization. So first of all, thanks for the talk. It was really, really interesting. And I mean, also I think very, very lucid. I have some a question, which is a bit maybe provocative, which is whether you think that basically choice is the right way forward when it comes to privacy, when it comes to user privacy. And for this, I was just thinking, during your talk, that on one hand, I would love to have so much choice for the software that I use when it comes to privacy. But at the same time, I would feel probably quite overwhelmed, right? If I had so much choice. Like if I go to the restaurant, I mean, it takes a while to choose, which dish I want, and I wouldn't want to choose the dish 20 times a day, for example, right? So, I mean, do you think that at some point? So, what I think is that if the people maybe were given also so much choice, do you think that in the end people would just try to minimize, to say no every time they can? And at that point, isn't it just easier to basically ban at the regulation level, to ban the bad privacy businesses, the practices, let's say, or at least support the good ones? So.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really important question, and it's a discussion that comes up a lot in this space, right? I think we can have both, right? I don't think choice means you have choice for everything all the time and you're being bombarded with cookie notices, right? That's terrible. And I think regulation and regulatory guardrails don't have to mean you don't have any choice, right? Like maybe some people do like targeted advertising and are okay with being tracked, right? Like I'm not one of them, but I hear those people exist. So I think it's finding the right level, right? Finding the right balance. And that's something we're trying to get at with our research on exposure sensitive populations, right? Like what are privacy needs that are potentially more universal, or privacy needs that are specific to at least larger groups, right? And based on that, can we craft regulation, craft policy that puts limits on what can be done with data? And the other aspect is thinking about, well, what practices are potentially surprising or unexpected to people, even if they're legal, right? And maybe those are practices that you might want to ask and check in with a person before and be like, hey, we're going to do this. Are you okay with that, right? And I think that's where choice becomes meaningful and useful. And regarding this notion like, oh, you know, we don't want to have choice all the time and everywhere. Well, you do have that on your smartphones, right? Like these apps are asking you for resource access before they can access location and all kinds of other resources. And my sense is that's not particularly overwhelming, because it's actually in the incentive both for the platform manufacturers and for the app makers to make it as seamless as possible, right? So by not thinking of it as a consent in the legal sense and consent in the kind of like GDPR sense, we have crafted usable and at least somewhat useful privacy interfaces almost by accident, right? Like it's kind of like Apple and Google just kind of charted that course, and that's what we're living with now. So I think we can have both, and it's finding that right trade-off that's important. I'm not for choice for everything. Don't overwhelm people with too much information, but I also think there needs to be some level of autonomy and ability to say like, no, I don't want this, or yes, I want something for certain practices. And I don't think we have a good understanding yet what those practices are.
Thanks. I just very, very quickly, do you think that, so about this, there is also space for another principle, like together, in addition to the three ones that you gave, which is basically automatable. So somehow, like, you know, if I'm vegetarian, maybe I want to set that preference like for each restaurant that I go to, right? I don't want to search for vegetarian dishes every time. So at the same time, like you could have like an automated preference at maybe at the OS level for tracking or anything else, and that you can actually, you know, then you have APIs or something like that. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think like for me, that falls under actionable. And I think we're seeing this in iOS, for example, right? Like you can turn off app tracking on the OS level. Whether that's actually effective and prevents apps from really tracking you, different question, right? But yeah, I think getting to a point where you don't have to set your privacy settings every time you switch browsers, right, would be very, very useful. Yeah.
Okay, so Claire, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, you mentioned the mental models of around technology and how users didn't particularly understand how the technology worked, and I wondered how well they understand the business models of the companies that they actually enjoy, and if everybody opted out of sharing their privacy things, then somebody else would have to pay for a lot of these services. So I just sort of wondered if you had any insights on that.
I think that's a good question. I don't have any deeper insight because it's not necessarily what we have studied so far. My sense is that people don't have necessarily a good understanding of the business models. But I also think that companies are often overstepping in their reach when it comes to data collection, and claiming those are legitimate business interests for why they're doing things. Like I understand that a company like Facebook operates based on, or Google operate based on advertisement. Doesn't mean they should be following me around everywhere on the internet, right? And in other apps and websites that are not their properties. So I think there are questions about the mental models, but I think there's also like a lot of this ad ecosystem is based on the notion that people actually don't understand what's happening and how the tracking works.
And then I think it's that you said, you know, could it be, rather than just compliance, could it be enhanced user experience? But if you don't fully understand it, then how's it going to enhance hence your experience. And sometimes if it was, causes that you believed in, you might be happy for that organization to monetize some of your data, but others less so. But
right.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. In the chat, we have a question from Emily. Emily, do you want to ask the question yourself? Okay, if not, then I will ask. I will read the question out. The question is: does your proposed solutions about users' privacy consider the different privacy sensitivities of different user groups, or is it a one solution fits all approach?
Yeah, I don't think it should be a one fits all approach, but it depends, right? Like I think when I say understand users' needs, I think that also means being sensitive who are different stakeholders and who are different groups, and particularly how might marginalized populations be disproportionately affected by some privacy risks that don't necessarily exist for the majority. And then that means sometimes you can have one size fits all solutions, and sometimes you need more specialized solutions.
Okay. Right. So I guess that's answer the question. And we have another one in the chat. Marsha, do you want to ask a question yourself?
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for the great talk. So there was this report on the Forbes that the America is collecting fingerprints on the social media, especially Facebook, from the pictures. I wonder how practical is that? What do you think about it?
So, sorry, it was really hard to understand the key part of your question. Can you repeat that? There was just some audio issues.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. So the question is that how practical is collecting fingerprints from social media pictures?
How practical is it to collect fingerprints from social media pictures?
Yeah.
I don't quite understand the context of the question. Maybe you can email me and we could talk about this offline.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay, right. Then we have another question from Adam. Adam, do you want to ask a question yourself?
Sure. Hi, Florian. Great talk. I was just wondering whereabouts in the design space you were thinking that providing the information to users regarding the implications of these decisions. So, for example, the example I was using with your Fitbit one, let's say they decided not to use the GPS, therefore less accuracy with regards to calorie counting and such a thing. So, whereabouts would that information be presented to users, or should it be presented? Yes, of course, I think it should. Anyway, on you go.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think the key again is like to make it part of the user experience, right? Like instead of thinking of these consent dialogues as like one shot and done, like I get a yes and a no. It's like, well, if the people say yes, or you can explain what that means. If people say no, you can explain what that means. And we actually see this in mobile apps, right? Ever since both iOS and Android switched to just-in-time permission dialogues. You see apps actually engage with that, right? Like if someone says, no, I don't give you access to my location, then apps often say like, oh, okay, now we can't show you this and that. If you change your mind, here's where you can go to reactivate location sharing. So I think there are already like design practices out there that help deal with that. And it comes down to really thinking of this not as a compliance issue, right? Like, okay, I need your consent before I can proceed. And then I don't care if you actually understood what happened, and making it more of a dialogue. And I think that's where we have to go.
Interesting, thank you.
Okay, we have a question from YouTube. The question is, can we really decide what is bad and good privacy at regulation level, considering its contextual?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, right? And I think it goes maybe shows also one of the differences between the European system and the US system when it comes to privacy and data protection regulation. The US is much more sectoral, so I think it's somewhat easier to craft specific rules and regulations for specific industry domains, whereas the European model has been very holistic, right? And in general, I'm a fan of the European approach, and I think the GDPR makes it so much easier for companies also to apply to what they're doing. But then in terms of how do you decide what is meaningful practice or what level is required, I think it comes down to risk assessments and privacy impact assessments. And so the GDPR requires companies that develop new technologies to conduct privacy impact assessments if they're at least if there's processing of sensitive personal information. But I think it's generally a good practice. And NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technology, Standards and Technology in the US, they're championing kind of like risk assessment based approach to privacy. So I don't think there's like a general solution, and you can't necessarily craft regulation that has very like that says like these are the 5 things that are allowed and these are the 5 things that are forbidden. I think it needs to be much more process oriented, and I think the GDPR is a good example for how we might. Well, I guess the proof is still in the pudding whether it works out, but I think the intention of the law is to kind of get companies and organizations to adopt processes that help consider privacy implications.
We have another question from YouTube. It says, are you also researching on how the privacy by design will apply to the older devices if the versions cannot accommodate the new updates?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah. We haven't looked at this too deeply. We've thought about this a little bit, right? Like, I think you can address it from different perspectives, right? It's like sometimes some of the things we do focus more on like, okay, if you're building new technology, this is what you might want to consider and how you can integrate privacy aspects into the design. For older technologies, maybe we can come up with some kind of aftermarket solutions, right? Like there's been interesting research on jamming devices for smart speakers that could basically prevent the smart speaker from listening when you don't want them to listen, for example. So I think there are creative ways of addressing existing technology, but it's potentially harder, yeah.
Okay. Buddy, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, excellent. By the way, you're still recording, Changyu. Is that intentional? Can you? Okay, that's fine. It's still recording. I thought you'd turn off recording by the time we do question and answer. But anyway, thanks for the talk, Florian. That's a very fascinating talk. I think you mentioned about it in passing earlier about whether there is a way to check if the data holder actually fulfills the promise they make regarding to the data. Is there a way to do that? Because maybe they promise to do all that anonymization and everything, but whether they do it or not, is it possible for a kind of as a data subject, whether you can, find that out?
Yeah, I think it's challenging. I think there's been research in this direction, right? Like how can you build trusted privacy systems, end-to-end trusted systems? How can you make some privacy guarantees verifiable? How to do this well in practice is, I think, still something we're kind of like working on as a community, and but I think internally you need something similar to be able to have the confidence that your organization is actually doing what you think it's doing for yourself, right? So I think companies internally are building these processes and these checks and balances to make sure what they're promising is actually what they're doing, so they don't get into trouble with regulators. But making this fully transparent, I think it's like it's a huge research challenge, and I would love to see more work in that area.
Okay, thank you.